So I wanted to share a clip from a Mormon Stories episode that really put things into perspective for me. I come from a very long line of Mormon ancestors, and all of my family except for my immediate siblings are all very active. I have shared many of my TikToks on social media and have written posts about this on my social media, and the answer that I most commonly get is nothing. So in this episode, John Larson explains why most Mormons don't leave the church.
This normalcy bias gets activated in human beings in the face of disaster. What I've just laid out to you is for most believing Mormons, leaving the church is in and of itself a disaster that needs to be avoided. So let's talk about a little bit about what happens when disaster strikes. I'm going to walk you through some recent disasters. Tenerife, I think is how it's pronounced. I'm not exactly sure. I only read the words. 1977, 2 airplanes crashed over the runway. One of the airplanes comes to a skidding stop and catches on fire on the front of the plane. An individual on the plane grabs his wife as this plane is slowly being engulfed in flames. And he had made note of the exit, so he and his wife head to the back of the plane. And when they get there, as it turns out, the back end of the plane had been sheared off, and he was able to jump out. He passed people sitting in their seats. The plane was full. These people weren't hurt. They were just sitting there in their seats staring at the fire, and they all burned to death. 9/11, first plane hits the building. We have people who survived who said after the crash, they returned to their desk and started working again, and it was only when people said, "You have to get out of the building," that they actually got up and left. 2004, the big tsunami in Southeast Asia. 230,000 people died. There is video footage from Thailand as this wave from the tsunami was traveling at 500 miles an hour. But what it did is the water all started sucking out of the bay. If you're, even I know this, I don't live next to the coast. If you ever see the water start receding at a quick rate, please run. But they just stopped. They stopped walking. They just stared at it. These people, almost to a person, died. 2018 in Hawaii, a message comes across everybody's cell phones. This is the message. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. There are people who took action, but the majority of people did absolutely nothing. They didn't alter what they were doing at all. 2020. February 3rd, the Chinese opened their second hospital that they built in 10 days. Meaning the world, spends the next 35 days or so assuring ourselves that nothing's going to happen until Black March 13th. That Black Friday, when the president announces there's going to be, that we're going into lockdown and most places of business shut down. Even then, 2 months later, early in the COVID-19 pandemic, people wanted to get back to normal and went back out, even though the majority of death and destruction occurred after that. This is not always just disaster. There's a famous example of corporations who, in the light of impending doom, do nothing. A famous case is Blockbuster. Blockbuster was facing the demise of the video rental business, and Netflix offered to buy them out, and they turned it down. This phenomena is called the normalcy bias. So I asked the question, what do you do when a fire alarm goes off? And the answer for almost all of us is nothing. What you believe people do in the face of disaster is that they run. But there's been lots of research done on this, and it breaks down about this way. In the face of a disaster, an impending problem that's going to happen, 70% of people, and we're going to talk about animals who show these same behavior patterns, 70% of people freeze. They do nothing, and they become docile. They actually stop thinking. They stop processing. They will just sit and stare. 15%, so of the remaining 30% of people, 15% panic. They freak out, and not in a good way. They just start screaming and running around in circles. And only 15% of people, research shows again and again and again, in the face of a disaster, will behave in the appropriate way. Let's start tying this into Mormonism. I've noticed over the years that when arguing with Mormons, and I'm sure many of the listeners out here, about not arguing, when you're trying to make a point, when you're trying to point out something, the biggest answer that you will get is nothing. You can send a big email to your mother, and you probably will get nothing in back. The normalcy effect predicts that behavior, that when confronted with a threat, you will most likely just be ignored, that most people want things to return to normal.
When people leave the church, the members are programmed to see this as a threat. Understanding that our brains are literally wired this way, it helps me see the members in my family with a little bit more grace.